Good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to see so many people coming to this panel this afternoon. It's never really easy to be sort of the first panel after lunch, but I think that we're in for a real treat today with three brilliant panelists to my left. So really excited to hear from all of them. My name is Samit. I am a legal advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Of course, I'm really thrilled to get us started on this discussion of unpacking some of these sort of very difficult legal questions regarding, of course, the role of international law in regulating cyberspace as well as outer space, and then I think also some particular challenges when it comes to state responsibility and others. Of course, these are questions that the ICRC has been thinking about for multiple years. As we explore sort of the legal dimension of these areas, I think it's worth pausing and taking a step back to remember what's at stake. And to be honest, it's something I think I've heard in the last 3 days, really throughout CyCon. This concept of the human cost. Maybe not exactly in those terms, but in the technological sort of workshops and the strategy workshops, as well as the legal one, this has come up time and time again, like this question of risk. It would be almost remiss for me not to talk a little bit about some of those risks as it relates to, the civilian population and some of the, significant humanitarian concerns that are in play. Because, of course, if space systems are disrupted or destroyed, the consequences are not abstract, right? They're very human, right? So hospitals losing contact, rescue operations failing, economies destabilizing, civilians caught in cascading crises. If I can speak for the ICRC, I mean space objects in particular for weather, for communication, for navigation, for Earth observation. I mean, these are essential to the work of the humanitarian services, for the medical services, from needs assessments all the way to delivery of relief, from recovery to disaster and conflict risk reduction. And of course, if conflict then extends into outer space, these risks multiply. And in such a scenario, of course, international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict applies. But IHL is only part of that picture. And as space becomes more central to both military and civilian life, we must also look to other bodies of international law to complete that picture. And to do that, of course, we have, like I said, three brilliant panelists with us today. So to get us started, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. P.J. Blunt. He's assistant professor of space law at Durham University's Space Research Center and executive secretary of the International Institute of Space Law, and a key voice, really, at the intersection of space, cybersecurity, and international law. Dr. Blunt's work explores the legal and strategic gray zones where space, cyberspace, and international law collide. I think he brings a really interdisciplinary perspective. We were just chatting earlier, and our discussions went from geopolitics to sort of technical discussions to security studies. So I think we're really in for we're really going to get a really interesting presentation in a few moments. Today, he'll really be giving us an overview of the legal landscape in space and how it's being transformed by technological change and shifting power dynamics. So Dr. P.J. Blunt, the floor is yours.
We decided as a group to use the podium, so that's what I'm going to do. So what I want to do is really sort of give some context. The following panelists have sort of very specific points to go into, but I kind of want to make a pitch for you of why this is important. Why do we care so much about cybersecurity in the space context? And the first thing that we always have to think about with cybersecurity is, what does it mean, right? And I tell my students all the time, you can get 10 cybersecurity experts into a room and you can all ask them all, what is cybersecurity? And they might give you 10 different answers. And space suffers from this as well. We have multiple layers of what we think of as cybersecurity. We've got this international level. We've got the organizational level. We've got individual levels of cybersecurity, and those all differ in unique ways. What I'm going to be talking about here is very much the international level, how this impacts on conflict. But to do that, I want to start with some older technology. This is an image of a space or air-to-space missile. This was from 1986. I believe it's a Midas missile. It is being launched by the United States to do an ASAT test, an anti-satellite weapons test. This missile took out a defunct SolarWinds satellite. To give you some context on this, throughout the 70s, the United States and the Soviet Union both pursued anti-satellite weapons. In the early 80s, the Soviet Union said, hey, maybe this isn't such a great idea. We're causing problems up there. And they declared a moratorium on testing for themselves. And the goal there was to get the United States to join with them. The United States, though, decided that they were just going to plow ahead. And in 1986, the Air Force did this test and successfully destroyed the satellite on orbit. At this point, just to give you the full story, Congress looked over at the Air Force and said, no, we shouldn't do that anymore. And they took away the money. So 1986 was indeed sort of the last anti-satellite test, well, until 2007, in which China did an anti-satellite test, taking out the FY-1C satellite. In 2008, the United States, not to be beaten by China, did it, and they shot down USA-193. Now, they argued that it wasn't an ASAT test, that they were doing it for health and safety reasons, but it was an ASAT test. In 2019, India does it, and then in 2021, Russia does it. Now, here's the problem with these tests. When you use a missile to blow up a satellite in orbit, we get the picture that, if you do space, right, you know this picture. We see it all the time. This is space debris. This is the stuff that's in orbit. This is not all active satellites. This is all the junk that's in orbit. Unlike an airplane, when you shoot down a satellite, you shoot down an airplane, it falls out of the sky. Some trucks come up, they clean it up. It's not nice, but it's something that you can clean up. What blows up in orbit stays in orbit, sort of like Vegas. So this is a problem, and it's a problem for you as the individual or as the state doing the anti-satellite operation too. All of these 4 states have a lot to lose in space. So if they begin to take out adversary satellites, they're giving themselves a black eye as well, because that is causing a problem for their own space operations. So we see here, there's a clear path for cyber. If you just turn the satellite off as opposed to blowing it up, well, there's only one piece of debris as opposed to thousands. So this notion of denial through cyber means is very big. Let me switch gears on you again. This is U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell trying to convince this UN Security Council that Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction. And whether or not we found them there, we did not. The United States decided they needed to take action on this. But we all know what this led to. It led to human suffering. It led to massive destruction in Iraq. It led to lots of death. And that wasn't great. Let's look at a different one. The United States also determined that Iran was pursuing weapons of mass destruction. And what did they do? Well, instead of going in and causing all that destruction, they launched Stuxnet, right? I imagine that in this conference, most of you are very familiar with Stuxnet. But essentially, this is the Natanz enrichment facility. And what they did is they used a computer virus to spin some of these centrifuges up real fast and then slow them down, and that caused a number of them to break, and it slowed down the development of weapons of mass destruction. So this is a really important moment because it was sort of the first big cyber-physical attack. But also, if you connect it back to that invasion of Iraq, it shows a massive change in how we think about and how we're doing things. And this is because cyber gives you this deniability, right? It gives you this moment of, oh, it wasn't us. And that's exactly, everybody knew it was the United States and Israel with Stuxnet. There is a great video of a US representative, and they're like, hey, did you do Stuxnet? And he goes, no. Okay, but they denied it, and that was sort of the end of it, right? Iran never really pursued it either. It puts you in this legal area where it's like, is it? I mean, that's what this room is all about, right? That gray area of legality. And it also gives you a whole nother layer of strategy, right? And as we've heard over and over, right, it puts you in this gray area of conflict. Let's connect that back to space. This is a picture that was tweeted out by dear leader Trump in first administration, right? And this is a failed space launch by Iran. And in that tweet of a classified photo, and I just have to point it out, right? You can see the shadow of the person taking a picture of the photo in a classified report. Right in the middle, that's that glare that you're always trying to avoid. Every time an app is like, take a picture of your ID, and you're like, I can't get this. That's right there in the middle. That is President Trump taking a picture of a classified document and then tweeting it out. Yay! Anyway, and he tweets out that, oh, maybe we had something to do with this. Maybe we had something to do with this. Now, this has never been confirmed, but the implication was that the United States deployed cyber capabilities to deny Iran access to space. And this is something that, again, it dates all the way back to, I think, 2001, when the George W. Bush space policy came out, which embraced this notion of space denial. We're going to deny access to space. Well, we could deny access to space by invading and causing lots of damage in human life, loss of human life, or we could hack in and say, we're not going to, we're going to deny you that way. Now, the other thing to note about this, and I just have to, I love this image, right? This gave our adversaries all sorts of information about our capabilities, right? This was a bad thing to declassify, but such is life. So that is a space denial. Let's look at another one. All right. In the run-up to literally the day before Russia invaded Ukraine, suddenly Viasat terminals all over Europe bricked, right? They suddenly became non-functional. Why? Well, there was a cyber operation against these terminals to deny the use of space communications to Ukraine during the invasion, right? And so here we have not a target of the space system itself, but the ground infrastructure that runs it. But it accomplishes the same thing. It denies you the use of your space capability. And if you are out there in the war studies area, right, and we're thinking about hybrid war and all of these things, like space is a critical component of that. Space is a critical part of how you get your data, how you communicate with your forces, and a lot of this all connects, right? So I told you in 2007, China did an ASAT, right? Why did they do that? Well, I would argue that one of the reasons they did that was to show the United States that, hey, we can knock you out in the theater around Taiwan. We can deny you for a limited time your access to your capabilities around Taiwan. And that's important because they don't need space there. The United States would be in aircraft carriers. They are reliant on space communications. So all of these things are very connected. So when we think about space and cyber, I like to pitch it as this. We have to think about risk and opportunity, right? Space opens up so many opportunities, right? So many very cool things happen from space. Just this week, right? If you were on any of your social media, this image from the James Webb Telescope came out of like thousands of galaxies, and one of them is bending. It's just a cool physics image. I don't understand physics, but it's cool, right? So space gives us lots of opportunities, but also, that's a fun astronomy one. But on my plane here, right? Satellite internet. I could read my email on an airplane. I refuse to connect to on-flight internet because I don't want to read my email on an airplane. But that is an opportunity. But as everybody in cyber knows, it opens up risk, right? I describe it as essentially you put your information in a room with an infinite number of doors and an infinite number of windows, and you're trying to guard all of those at once, and that is a huge risk to you. And speaking of that in-flight service, I was on Air Baltic. Air Baltic uses Starlink. This is an image of Starlink satellites. Usually this image is used to talk about the notion of dark and quiet skies and how we're polluting the skies. But I want to talk about how integrated these things are now. And this is the thing that we really have to accept. The space operation that is on everybody's lips at the moment is Starlink. Starlink is a communications system that is intended to bring internet access to you, the individual, right? That you connect directly to the satellite. This is a huge opportunity, but it is also a massive risk, right? Suddenly, you own the terminal that connects to the satellite. That's not how things have kind of worked in the past, right? And so this opens up all sorts of risks. And I would say, right, if you don't think that adversary nations have a stack of Starlink terminals and are reverse engineering those and finding backdoors and finding ways to get in, Like, I don't have any specialized knowledge. I'm not read into any classified stuff. I would say 100%, right? There are nations that are breaking these things down and taking them apart to try to figure out how to exploit this. And this notched up when Starlink became involved as the military communications in Ukraine, right? So risks are everywhere. And that brings us, of course, to this question of law, right? What role does law play? And I'm one of those international lawyers that gets the law is real soft in international law. So I come at it from this perspective of almost international law is what states agree that it is. And that's very problematic when you want hard norms that constrain states. But the thing that we're seeing right now in the international legal system is we thought we had a bunch of really good norms, but we're seeing that states are increasingly just ignoring those. They send people off to talk about them, and then they just ignore them. And I think that that is the problem that we have to deal with. How do we construct law, and maybe even a broader idea of governance so that it actively constrains states? And I'm going to leave it at that and actually let the other panelists dive into some actual law, because that is my last slide. With that, I will pass it back.
DJ, thank you so much. I mean, that was just a really insightful overview of the legal challenges and sort of the very operational challenges, and really efficient, by the way. I think you've covered a lot of ground in a very small amount of time. I think now we can sort of hone in on some of these really specific legal questions, which both Anna and Julia will be doing. But first, I'd like to introduce next Anna Blikova, who's an expert in space law and policy, a researcher and a PhD candidate at Masaryk University, who will be sharing her thoughts on some of the most critical issues in space infrastructure and international law. Anna's work centers in part on the practical implementation of international law in space, particularly how legal frameworks can adapt to the rapid developments in space technologies and address emerging security challenges. In addition to her expertise in space governance, Anna will be presenting her paper, which was published in the context of course, this week's conference, which takes a critical look at the vulnerabilities in global communication infrastructure. In her paper, Anna argues that relying solely on either subsea cables or satellite infrastructure to secure our communication systems is a risky proposition. Anna will explain to us why a more coordinated approach, one that is firmly rooted in the law, is necessary to protect both subsea cables and satellite systems in today's very volatile geopolitical landscape. Anna, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Samit, for your kind introduction, and PJ for a great overview of the current landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm truly excited that today I have the privilege of speaking to you about one of the most complex, maybe opportunities, as PJ already said, in the context of cybersecurity and law. And it's about the evolving transition from subsea cables to satellites as the backbone of our international digital connectivity. Before I begin, I have one preliminary remark. After this presentation, you find yourself with more questions than answers. Good. That is precisely what this talk's meant to do. My primary objective is to raise awareness and about the relationship between subsea cables and satellites, and to spark, I really hope, meaningful debate in this area in the future. So with that, let me begin. We live in a digitalized society where our lives are closely tied to cyberspace. Where it is global finance, diplomacy, energy distribution, or daily communication, our dependency on secure and reliable infrastructure has never been greater, as has been said many times at this conference. But this dependence brings with it a responsibility to understand and mitigate the legal and strategic risks we face. The risks I focus on this presentation lie under the sea as well above the skies. Let me begin with examining the current backbone of our internet infrastructure, which are subsea cables. Subsea cables carry approximately 95% of the world's international data. Moreover, there have been continuous exponential improvements in transmitting capacity of these subsea cables. For example, the 8 fiber pair Maria, which is cable which was laid in 2018, and connecting Spain and the US, can carry 24 terabytes per second. That's quite a lot. or at least I really think that it's quite a lot. Moreover, these undersea lines span over 1.2 million kilometers and are arteries of the global economy, which enabling more than $10 trillion in financial transactions every day. Huge amount of money. And all of these facts are astonishing given the fact that individual submarine cable on the high seas is typically 17 to 22 millimeters in diameter. So it means that it's like a diameter of a beer bottle cap or a garden hose. So even though they could seem really tiny, their importance cannot be overstated. Yeah, so here you can see the map of the subsea cables, and however, they are also especially vulnerable. Many of these cables pass through the narrow and easily targeted strategic choke points, as you can see on the picture. So, if we will consider Iceland hosting major data center and connected by one of 4 submarine cables, Cyprus, crucial hub for Mediterranean connectivity, and Ireland, critical gateway for transatlantic communication, any attack or disruption at these junctions could have massive regional or even transnational consequences. So yes, subsea cables are vulnerable, and in connection to cybersecurity and especially cyber attacks, there are some challenges we need to raise awareness about. While the failure of a single cable might have limited immediate consequence due to redundancy mechanism, scenarios involving simultaneous damage to multiple cables, compounded by the limited availability of repair vessels, could trigger cascading connectivity failures. And unfortunately, recent years have proven that such disruptions are not just hypothetical. In the Baltic Sea from 2023 to 2024, Chinese vessels were reportedly involved in damaging multiple cables and gas pipelines. In Egypt in 2022, a single cable cut resulted in outages across 7 countries. So one cut, 7 countries out of the internet. And in 2024, Houthi militants damaged cables in the Red Sea, affecting nearly a quarter of European Asian internet traffic. So, and Taiwan, Matsu Islands, also experienced such a disruption because they were completely disconnected in 2023 when their sole undersea link was severed. And this caused in 50 days with crippling slow internet before Taiwan was able to repair the connection. These cases are symptomatic of broader instability. Indeed, we also must recognize the larger geopolitical context in this area. Tension among Russia, China, EU, and US have been growing, and with them, the strategic value and vulnerability of digital infrastructure has increased. Moreover, despite the limited number of subsea cables providers and operators, Europe and the United States have chosen to restrict one of the largest subsea cable providers, the Huawei Marine Networks. So even in that complicated situation, we are given another complex attributes that are getting it even more complicated. If our primary infrastructure is increasingly under attack, it becomes necessary to envision Plan B scenarios, and thus in response, actors such as Taiwan and NATO have begun exploring alternatives to traditional infrastructure of subsea cables. One possibility in the development of an alternative network, namely a satellite-based one. Another is that we double down on the existing infrastructure, and the final scenario is a hybrid approach, getting the best of the both worlds by integrating the scalability of the subsea cables with the flexibility of satellite infrastructure. Not surprisingly, such a hybrid solution is already on the table. This brings us to the NATO's funded HEIST initiative, and this program is designed to defect cable disruption quickly, reroute high-priority traffic with satellites, and maintain resilience during outages, in addition to strengthening the satellite architecture integrates hybrid space subsea communication framework. This system, or the development of the system, is not done just by the NATO, but also other countries. Another example is Taiwan. And following that, I would like to pause briefly for a really short disclaimer and a small confession. I am not involved in any of these projects, so I don't have any extra information. I cannot provide them, unfortunately. And at the very beginning of this presentation, or thinking about this presentation, I thought that the law of the sea and outer space law are kind of similar with the principles, and thus the navigating these challenges would be really easy. Long story short, it's not that easy as I really thought. So now we can go back to the presentation. Regarding the legal framework of subsea cables, we really need to focus what are the main areas which are governing it. It's Cable Convention and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is known as the UNCLOS. And these specific documents define maritime jurisdiction in the following way: up to 12 nautical miles from a state's coastline is considered territorial waters where the state enjoys full sovereignty. Up to 200 nautical miles constitutes the exclusive economic zones where sovereignty is partial, and beyond that lie the high seas, which are beyond national jurisdiction. So what are the limitations of current legal framework regarding the sea? Despite the clarity on a paper, enforcement and practical application fall short. So what are the limitations, especially when we are speaking about cyber attacks on subsea cables? UNCLOS contains almost no cybersecurity specific provisions. It lacks mechanisms for rapid response, transnational enforcement and accountability in cases involving hybrid or cyber threats, and as a result, cables owned by private entities and spanning multiple jurisdictions are particularly difficult to protect through existing legal channels. Unlike ships, cables are not flagged to any single state, which is really important regarding any legal challenges and legal examination we will do there. And nor is it a national of a cable an easy question. Legal ownership is often divided among various owners, creating a legal kaleidoscope of jurisdiction. So if I will shift to responsibility for subsea infrastructure, it is necessary to point it out that under international law, the states are not automatically responsible for every action committed by the individual within their jurisdiction. That is kind of clear. Nevertheless, under certain conditions, states can be held responsible for the actions for individuals. Even outside their territory, we have quasi-territorial jurisdiction regimes which are mostly connected to law of the flag. The principle also applies to activities beneath the sea and may align with RCVA rules. Key provisions in this area are Article 1, 2, 28, and 30, which are outlining the basic principles. So another important dimensions which I want to bring up here is the fact that regarding subsea cables, they also have the protection under international humanitarian law. According to Article 54 of the Annex to the Fourth Hague Convention, submarine cables connecting an occupied territory with a neutral territory shall not be seized or destroyed except in case of absolute necessity, and must likewise be restored and compensation fixed when the peace is made. This provision looks good on a paper, but it's outdated and is largely inapplicable because there is no neutral cable anymore, and thus it's obsolete. Nevertheless, the history gives us a cautionary example, and in 1924, an arbitral tribunal ruled that although Great Britain was neutral in the Spanish-American War, submarine cables transmitting the military information between Spain and its colonies were legitimate military targets. And I think that this is still relevant today, and it's really important to have it in mind. So now turning to space, satellite governance is primarily based on the so-called cosmic treaties. The relevant ones in this context are Outer Space Treaty, Liability Convention, and Registration Convention, and they were negotiated in the 1960s and 70s. And these arrangements introduced the important principles how to deal with the outer space. Nevertheless, now we are in the new space era, and thus these outdated treaties are not that relevant anymore because they were made for a different environment than we have now. So when we are speaking about responsibility in space, it is necessary to focus on Article 6. Article 6 of Outer Space Treaty is saying that even the states are responsible even for the activities of private parties. That makes sense in like back in the days because there were like no that like huge amount of private entities, but it's getting more complicated today. So another thing that's just like really connected to this is like the attribution challenge in space activities. This led us to a noteworthy phenomenon, especially in the context of like the responsibility for the private entities, because the threshold for attribution under the law could seem lower than under general international law, because there is no effective or like overall control test. The responsibility is like written down in the Outer Space Treaty. As Wang and Hu have observed, even if certain commercial space activities are defined as national activities, so-called, of a state A, under space law, this does not automatically mean that they can attribute to a state A under the law of the state responsibility. And here is it where the situation is getting more and more complicated regarding that. And comparing to subsea cables with satellite infrastructure, I would like to give your attention to like these specific topics. Like, to be really honest, like at least for now, the capacity and speed of the infrastructure out of space is not like on the same level at underseas. So satellites could be a viable option in that area, but they are definitely not like on the same level, not yet. But like the technology is evolving, so maybe in the future we'll be on that time. Also, we need to speak about the attack vectors, which are like of course different in that area, and last but not least, about the legal framework regarding that, because when we are speaking about the outer space, we're speaking about like the basic principles and nothing more, actually. But when we are speaking about the law of the sea, the agenda there and like the legal framework is much more developed. So from that point of view, even though it could really seem at the first point that like the space law is like easier to have because we have like the direct responsibility there between the states and the private companies, it's not that much easy anymore. Regarding the attribution of cyber attacks, we are like dealing with like the things that are normally in the cyberspace. So attribution is a challenge in outer space as well as underseas, and we are lacking not the understanding, but consensus of like which control test would be like the applicable one even in outer space and as well as under the seas. And both of the domains has like a huge regulatory gaps, at least for now. So regarding that, I think that we should be more focused on how we fill these gaps. One of the options is soft law regulation or private regulation. It's like the subcategory of the soft law in that way. And even though like this regulation is non-binding per se, and it's like under much more quick development, still it's better to have something than nothing, because to be really honest, the hard law regulation is not happening in this area, nor the space, nor the subsea cables. There are some of the types of the regulation in this area, and like I'm almost like concluding. What I think that is like the biggest value of hybrid infrastructure systems is like enhanced security, redundancy of the systems, and complementary strengths. Because if we will compare like the best of the subsea cables as well as the best of the satellites, we can really build up a really resilient system and redundant system, which can like help us, especially during the armed conflicts. And I'm optimistic. I'm academic, I'm optimistic, and I really hope that there is a way how to work on the regulation, because I think that with increasing awareness about these topics, we can make the extra step and deal with the regulation itself. And yeah, the regulation, if I will sum it up, is like that we probably should like update UNCLOS. We definitely need to modernize the space law, because as I already said, it was developed in the time where like there were almost no private sector at all, and we maybe should focus on like supporting the hybrid solutions, because like the scalability of the systems is really important for us. And we of course need to enhance cooperation, which already like was said many times on this conference. So this is the conclusion. I think that the international collaboration is really important, if I should highlight it. And yeah, I'm optimistic. I think that we still have like the way how to get better, and I hope that we will go in that direction. Thank you very much for your time, and yeah, if you have any questions, I'm really looking forward to them.
Anna, thank you so much for that. I think that was a really clear sort of exposition of course, existing frameworks, but I think you also did a really good job of pointing out some of these ambiguities that exist. I want to sort of abuse my moderator privilege a little bit and ask you already a question now, if that's okay, before we sort of let you go for now. Because I'm wondering, you know, when you, and again, you really clearly laid it out, sort of the difference between what's in RCWA versus the Outer Space Treaty. And I think you also pointed out sort of the cogent legal and maybe even practical reasons why sort of the standard for state responsibility is different. So two parts to this question, and I shamelessly say that this will, like, you know, I'm asking this question self-interestedly because I think it's really relevant to my work as well. So first of all, do you think that those cogent reasons, like with regard to the Outer Space Treaty, do you think that they're really all outdated, or do you think there's still some relevance to the way state responsibility is formulated? And additionally, how do you think that sort of interplay between RC1 and the Outer Space Treaty, how does that affect other bodies of international law? And I'm thinking particularly, but feel free to go in, you know, explore this the way you wish, but I'm thinking particularly of course, IHL, what a surprise, and, you know, the notion of, you know, the threshold of a resort to armed force, right? So with a resort to armed force, it's also ultimately a state responsibility question. How does that interplay affect that?
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. I like them. Like regarding the Outer Space Treaty and like its outdated like situation, I think it's really important to focus on the fact that like Outer Space Treaty is treaty on principles. So it's still something which is really like basic, and we should like work on it. So from that perspective, we still can have it and use it in many ways, even like in the current situation. Nevertheless, like we kind of stopped at that level and didn't like make the extra steps, especially regarding the hard law. So from that point of view, it's a great first step, but I think that we really need to do like extra more of them. And regarding the second question, especially like with the other arenas, with the IHL in outer space, I think that it's really important to highlight there that like in general, outer space should be like the peaceful arena. This is written in the Outer Space Treaty, and there is still a discussion, what does it mean? If it is like mean like non-aggressive or non-military like arena of outer space and like arena of all of us. So from that point of view, we maybe need to like make a step back and like think firstly about this question and then like speak about the application of IHL. To be really honest, I think that IHL should be applicable now to space, because even though space should be a peaceful arena, from the very first beginning, space was used for military. And the reason why we like launched Sputnik, and the reason why we like were like more interested about the space, it wasn't just some kind of it wasn't just about the exploration. It was definitely about getting the military advantage there. So yeah, IHL is definitely an important topic there, but it's a really broad topic, and the topic we still need to like develop a lot in outer space.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to also coming back to this discussion a bit later, the question and answers. But next, I'd like to move to our final panelist today, Giulia Pavesi. Giulia is a research fellow on space security and defense at the European Space Policy Institute, where she leads studies on regional defense mechanisms and their relationship to space, the Roundtable of Space Commanders at the European level, and research projects on space in support of security and defense needs. Today, Giulia will also be, like Anna, presenting her paper, also published in the context of CyCon and written together with her colleague who's in the room, Andrea Alberti, entitled NATO at a Crossroad Between Space and Cyber Threats, so that we can reflect together on how the legal community can address the growing security challenges in outer space, as well as the profound relationship between space, as well as the cyber domain. So Giulia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much also for giving the opportunity to both of us, in fact, to present this paper. For this paper, we adopted a bit an interdisciplinary approach, and so we evaluated several layers that should be included in the evaluation of the potential activation of Article 5. We started from the attack surface, and based actually on proprietary information that we developed at ESPI, we tried to understand how the population of space objects concretely shifted, both in terms of amount of satellites, which until 15 years ago actually could be in the order of hundreds, to the current situation, which really represents the attack surface, the kind of actors that actually operate such actors, and how these are distributed among the NATO partners. We saw that clearly of the 13,000 payloads that we roughly counted, of these military, it's only 480. And we saw that most of them are located in LEO. We also saw that in relation to the actors that operate this kind of actors within NATO's member states, most of them are in fact commercial actors, which brings us back actually to some of the points that will also be addressed in the discussion. We then try to understand basically how the two domains have evolved within the NATO framework, and also at what speeds. The speed element is actually quite important for two elements. On the one side, because historically, of course, the cyber domain was at the quite early stages of 2000s already included in the operational dimension of NATO, also because of proprietary networks and so on, while the space dimension arrived very later, mostly because the alliance doesn't really own any space asset. The second element is that while actually the conceptualization of space within NATO, the inclusion of space within NATO, basically unfolded only in the last 7 years, this didn't happen in an integrated way compared to the cyber domain, both at the level of command structures, at the level of concepts, and at the level of doctrine. We then moved forward and tried to understand and come up with a sort of matrix of what could be the elements on a case-by-case evaluation for the Article 5 clause in relation to cyber operations targeting space assets. And here, actually, we found out that the complexity unfolds mostly on three layers: the legal, the political, and the operational. I will start with the legal. In relation to the legal one, of course, we questioned whether, basically, what is also the relationship between the two regimes, and so between international space law, which is a specialized legal framework designed to address on a norm-to-norm basis the peculiarities of space, and international law at large. As I assume that here a lot of you are maybe also experts on space law, of course, we have here the help of Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty that tells us that international law also applies, of course, to the domain, to this domain, but also the Article 103 of the UN Charter and Article 30 of the Vienna Convention that basically tells us that international law is also applicable. When then we try to assess then how international law, and particularly the regime on the use of force, is applicable to outer space operations, this is another, let's say, another issue. The first element to solve, which has been brought over 2 decades of discussions, in fact, also by scholars, is whether the territorial scope of the prohibition of Article 2.4 actually prevents us from basically bringing all the corpus of the jus ad bellum in the space domain. And here we agree that with also most of the scholarship that such an error interpretation is for sure nor advisable, not acceptable. We then try to understand, and as we know from the ICJ jurisprudence, not all use of forces also constitute armed attacks, so we try to think about possible thresholds that could determine whether basically a use of force is more or less grave compared to others. And here, while in relation to, for instance, kinetic operations, the assessment is a bit more straightforward, in relation to operations that have reversible effects or are reversible in the sense of the behavior that the operation in itself, it's much more difficult to both assess the scale and effects in relation to very interdependent and dependent infrastructures, as well as there is also the element of attribution, as also Anna mentioned. So here we said, okay, but then can we look perhaps at critical infrastructure theory? Can we understand whether specific infrastructures could be identified as space critical infrastructure, which is also consistent with states' practice that at national level have started either to publicly declare some infrastructures as critical space infrastructures, while like literally signaling also to potential attackers that they consider such infrastructure as critical, or by basically creating and establishing classified lists of critical infrastructure. So in the determination, eventually, of the thresholds for having an armed attack, we think critical infrastructure theory and designation can certainly play a role. In this sense, what could be the role of the alliance in relation to the legal layer? And I went very fast, of course, you can read the paper for a more extensive analysis. The role of the alliance here can be a twofold. On the one side, NATO could promote a classified internal dialogue on national approaches and criteria for the identification of such thresholds, and for the identification of specific infrastructure as critical infrastructures. This is something that actually we also noticed by scrutinizing a number of national approaches diverge very much at national level based on how states, of course, employ and use space infrastructure. In addition, to evaluate the scope and the effects of the attack, we think that exercises simulating complex attack scenarios could also, which also, for instance, involve multi-domain operations, could help assess the nature of the targeted infrastructure and its externalities, basically based on different scenarios. We also think that in this context, also the temporal element of the attack and the fortuity or the intentionality of the attack should be, and the circumstances surrounding the attack in itself should be taken into account within the exercise. For the political layer, we basically understand, and we started from the assumption that, of course, NATO's approach to determine the activation of Article 5 on a case-by-case basis is in itself a foundational element of deterrence, including in space, leaving the attacker in a situation of uncertainty with respect to the expected response to, for instance, a cyber attack against the space infrastructure. But, and therefore also ambiguity actually around the possible thresholds that would determine the activation of Article 5, actually such ambiguity reinforce NATO's deterrence. On the other side, however, the other side of the coin is that a lack of clarities of NATO's stance towards these threats and the lack of consistency of action, in fact, especially in light of an expected, let's say, insurgence of this kind of operations in the years to come, would actually weaken the alliance. So we think that in this regard, a potential recommendation for action for the alliance should be to focus very much also on the political narrative that accompanies the response to the threat, with the alliance, should it decide to activate Article 5, basically transparently communicate evidence of the attack and at the same time emphasizing the alliance commitment to the proportionality in the response and the rule of law to ensure also the international credibility of the alliance. At the operational layer, we also, but before coming to the operational level, let's go first to the case studies, because in relation to the political, let's say, layer, we ask ourselves whether states today possess actually the political will also to address these issues at NATO level. So we analyzed two hypotheses of traditional cyber attacks and cyber attacks against space systems, and we tried to understand basically what were the reactions or the mixed or inaction in this case of states vis-à-vis this attack. In both cases, we identified a consistency of inaction by both states, potentially resulting in the establishment actually of a higher threshold in relation to cyber operations when they target space operations. And then we go back at the political level, the operational layer. In relation then to the operational layer, and I can get back actually on the case studies if you have questions on that. In relation finally to the operational layer, it was actually a few years ago, the US Space Force Space Operations Command General Stephen Whiting admitted that cyberspace is the soft underbelly of our global space networks. And these statements actually very well reflect the decentralized command structures that we have in relation to the two domains. The fact that, as we saw in the initial analysis of the evolution of the two domains, basically at the operational level, both domains have been addressed as a domain-specific operation centers, doctrines, and so on. And we don't have a cross-domain integrated approach for now. We also identified that for now we have a lack of standards in relation to multi-domain operations, although the concept was introduced since 2018. Also when we had actually joint exercises at national level targeting the cyberspace segment. We also identified a scattered, let's say, technical cybersecurity hygiene across the NATO alliance, especially in relation to CSI. And we also noticed a misalignment in data classification levels between NATO members. So, I still have 2 minutes. Another element that we tried to address in this publication was also to try to answer to some of these questions by analyzing the different policy strategies that NATO's member states have adopted in the last 2 decades. And while we see that actually more than 80 different policy strategies to some extent either mention space or defense and cyber, either all the 3 elements or 2 of them, the variety of the approaches reflects actually national different prerogatives and perspectives. We have also at the level of responses that states are putting in place fragmentation, and the same also at the level on how do they interpret specific behaviors in space vis-à-vis other behaviors, and this lack of cohesion hinders the development of a unified and effective strategy then at the alliance level. So our recommendations, of course, which can be summarized here and which, of course, I explained during the analysis, basically focus on the 3 layers and should be implemented in an integrated approach. In relation to the legal layer, actually, also the alliance in itself, in its overarching policy, started to refer to this concept of responsible behavior in space. So in this sense, it would also be helpful to understand at the alliance level what states see as responsible behavior. We should define or develop at least a NATO-wide approach to if not critical space infrastructure, space that are deemed to be critical to support NATO's operations. At the political layer, we should build consensus of what should be potential responses thresholds by leveraging, as mentioned, exercises, and we should really streamline the alliance narrative when a response is triggered. Finally, at the operational level, we should, of course, integrate more and more the cyber and space dimension, especially in light, once again, of cross-domain exercises or multi-domain exercises, and we should revise or at least ensure a minimum cybersecurity standards and best practices across the alliance. Thank you.
Well, Giulia, thank you so much. I mean, I think you really brought in an important sort of piece of this, of our corpora juris puzzle, which is the jus ad bellum questions, first of all. So thank you so much for that. In your presentation, you also talked a lot about certain ambiguities, and I think that came up also in the two other presentations. So certain ambiguities, and you also talked about certain efforts at finding consensus, right? At sort of coming to common understandings. And I want to ask you a question, and then I think, like I said, this question is relevant for the other panelists, so maybe we then can work backwards. And I'd love to hear also, and I'd love to hear from you and PJ, you as well, on this question that you raised on responsible behavior. And I want to bring it back to some of the mechanisms that are in place to precisely, find common understanding among states and also more broadly in the international community. And so, of course, we have the open-ended working group on cyber, we have an open-ended working group on space, and there's sort of varying levels of success with respect to different bodies of law in both of those working groups. But both of them do emphasize this importance of this terminology, right? Responsible behavior by states. And I'm wondering legally and also I think sort of operationally, what can you walk us through what responsible behavior means? First of all, and maybe also, and again, I think both of you can come in on this as well. What is the relationship between responsible behavior and state responsibility? Is there a perfect overlap? Is there a partial overlap? How much irresponsible behavior are states responsible for? So please, Giulia.
Yeah. So it's a complex question. So the concept of responsible behavior is a concept that has evolved especially in the last decade, both through unilateral approaches, so for instance by unilateral commitments by states not to, for instance, test and deploy the ASATs, capabilities, but also at the level of processes within the Conference of Disarmament to, let's say, unlock the process that for years actually have characterized the discussions around arms control in space. The concept of responsible behavior is in itself a political concept in the sense that from a legal perspective, international responsibility is one thing and it follows a wrongful act in international law, which means that you have then to determine what are the objective and the subjective elements of what constitutes a wrongful act. And on the other side, this concept of responsibility instead is much more tied to specific conducts of states. Now, the open-ended working group, which was launched a few years ago, for the first time, as mentioned, tried to address this dreadlock within the Conference of Disarmament by basically, first of all, gathering member states and the civil society also, so different communities, which until then they were not actually included in the discussion, to try to first try to understand what was the applicable law, what were the threats that states perceived as threats, what could be possible norms that could address such threats, and eventually to come up with a consensus. Such consensus was not achieved and was actually opposed not only at the content level but also the procedural level. On the one side, because also of the involvement of civil society, and on the content-wise level, because the concept of responsible behavior in itself was basically qualified as a political concept. Then we had other two, let's say, parallel and open-ended working groups which pursued the two different approaches put forward by the initiator, let's say, of each open-ended working group, in which still basically resulted in dueling processes and in dueling approaches. So to some extent, we are actually now seeing that their work at the moment is not looking very promising. Once again, even due to objections to set up an agenda for the meetings. However, I think the very valuable element of the open-ended working group is that on the one side, it brought really states delegation together to discuss what did they conceive as the threats. It brought states together also to sort of support unilateral initiatives, which actually culminated then in international instruments in relation to specific type of counterspace, and particularly in relation to very destructive and debris-producing weapons. And it also started to build consensus, let's say, among few states on what states actually intended with responsible behavior. So in this sense, on the one side, the normative, let's say, aspect of these instruments shouldn't be undervalued, as it started, in any case, to create a discussion among states on potential core elements that might eventually lead to some hard law instruments. On the other side, however, it also created, and this in the long term we should see whether it would paralyze or not actually the discussion in relation to arms control in space, of really dueling processes, dueling instruments, which eventually, if they are built on consensus, they might actually result in failure.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna.
Yeah, like what I maybe just want to quickly add to this discussion, and the thing that Julia already said is what was the motivation to at least start the discussion about the responsible behavior? It was mostly the anti-satellite weapons and anti-satellite instruments, and the reason why we are that much scared of them is the fact, as already PJ said at the very beginning, that there is there is a space debris which is connected directly with anti-satellite weapons, and the fact why the space debris is still really an issue regarding the outer space is twofold. First of all, we are not able to collect the space debris and get rid of it, so we are we are just adding more and more space debris there. And another thing is that space debris is creating or triggering something which we are calling Kessler syndrome, and this cascading syndrome is saying or demonstrating that the more space debris we will have on the orbit, the more space debris we'll create. And the final stage of this so-called Kessler syndrome is that the density of the space debris will be so high that we wouldn't be able to use the outer space anymore on the way how we are using it nowadays. So yeah, the responsible behavior is definitely something we would like to focus our attention on. Nevertheless, even with the connection to anti-satellite weapons, we didn't find a conclusion that to use these anti-satellite weapons is something which is irresponsible. So you can imagine the discussion which is around it.
Thanks, Anna. I'm so glad you brought up the Kepler syndrome. I wonder if, now that you've sort of opened the door on it, PJ, in your answer, so of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts on responsible behavior, but can you also maybe tell us, now that we've just heard this explanation of the Kepler syndrome, what does that mean in terms of obligations under IHL? Conflict.
This is loaded.
What does that mean in terms of sort of the precautions, for example, a party to a conflict needs to take before undertaking a an attack, for example? What do you think the implications are? And I guess one of the points is that there's this clear difficulty that in sort of calculating how far along the gradient we are in terms of risk of resulting in a Kepler syndrome. Is that, if that's my understanding?
Okay. Well, I'm going to start with the responsible behavior bit of this, because, and I'm going to play context guy again, because I think this is a really interesting thing. So back in the 2000s, right, there was this, and actually this goes all the way back to the 80s, right? There's this push, right? We want more legal things for space security. But it always hit this wall of, well, we can't define a space weapon, right? What's a space weapon? You can find all these UN statements about defining a space weapon, and it just went round and round in circles, right? And very similar to, what is a cyber weapon, right? So there was this shift in, I think around 2005, 2006, to, well, let's think about codes of conduct. Let's think about regulating in terms of behavior as opposed to regulating in terms of specific technologies. And this was sort of a critical piece to the puzzle, because also, I mentioned that Bush space policy about space denial. The United States had said, we oppose any new legal norms for space. We're not even going to sit down at the table and talk about them. And when the United States doesn't sit down at the table to talk about something in space, that's a problem, right? They have outsized power in this field. So there was this push for codes of conduct. There was an EU code of conduct that failed at the negotiation level. Even though the United States had come in, China and Russia showed up at the negotiation, and they were just a wrecking ball right through it. And I was there day one. By the end of day one, it turned into a consultation. It was no longer a negotiation. So then responsible behavior comes along, and it really finds its sort of textual origin in a United Nations General Assembly resolution from the United Kingdom on the notion of rules of responsible behavior in space. And the United States, though it does not vote for the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space Treaty or the resolution, or the no first use resolution at the UNGA, they were able to come on board here because it was understood that responsible behavior was not going to be binding norms. It was going to be something more fluffy, right? Well, it sounds great, right? I'm a native English speaker. Responsible behavior sounds really normal to me, right? That's what we should do. You go out on the street, be responsible, be nice, right? China and Russia don't see it that way. They say that this is a mechanism for pushing Western norms onto us. And I've recently written a chapter that's somewhat sympathetic to this, right? Responsible behavior is an empty vessel. It sounds great, but there is no content within responsible behavior yet. Presumably, the goal is to build that content out. But there is this problem in that, whose notion of responsibility? Right? And this connects over into your question about, well, how does this connect to state responsibility? And I've actually recently, in this chapter, right, I point out that responsibility is backward-looking, right? It's something happened. Let's figure out who needs to make amends for it. Responsible behavior is forward-looking. It's this idea that you should behave in a certain way going forward. Now, maybe if you breach that, you end up in the state responsibility bucket, but they aren't really the same thing. And I think until we are able to sort of bridge this gap that we see in cyber, we see it in space, between sort of the Western perspective and what I would say is now the China-led perspective, we're not going to have any motion in this. And there might need to be this ability to sort of, hey, look, responsible behavior sounds great to me, but we might need to abandon that if we're going to actually make progress. I would also suggest that the main states here don't really want to make progress, and that's the problem. Kessler syndrome. And IHL. I haven't written on this in a long time, but I did write about it once. This notion, the Kessler syndrome, for those that you don't know, is this notion that once you create debris up there and you get enough of it, it'll begin to collide with itself, and you get a cascade of debris. You essentially do exponential growth, and low Earth orbit becomes inaccessible to you because you can't launch through anything, and that's a real problem. So when that connects over to IHL, I think this goes back to those kinetic ASATs, right? And make sure I get my language right here. In IHL, there's this general idea that you shouldn't create long-term widespread, or what damage?
You're talking about the environment.
Environmental.
It's in INMOD and it's in Geneva.
It's an additional protocol one.
Yeah, but it's widespread long-term and what? There's a third thing.
It's environmental.
Widespread,
Widespread.
Yeah.
Widespread. Okay,
environmental consequences.
So let's say you fire a missile at a satellite on orbit. You have now created thousands of pieces of debris. They will be up there for decades. So FY1C, the one that I spoke about, the Chinese ASAT, all of that debris is still up there, and it will be up there for decades. It does eventually come down, but it'll be up there for decades. That sounds long term. It is literally circling the globe, right? That sounds widespread. So this question is, well, how does it connect over to IHL? Well, in INMOD, the Environmental Modification Treaty, that's very dependent on whether you intended to cause that damage to the environment as a method of means of warfare. If your intent was to knock out the satellite because your adversary was getting an advantage from it, that doesn't, to my understanding, fall under INMOD. It might impact the legality of that weapon, though, right? If you know that your weapon is going to cause long-term widespread, but if it's going to cause that, then it might impact the legality of the weapon in its inability to distinguish, right? It is an indiscriminate weapon. We haven't seen this test yet because, well, we haven't seen an actual ASAT used in a conflict, right? The ASATs that we've seen are all tests by a state on an asset that they already own. But there is this connection to IHL that I think is important, and it might be the only limitation that we have because the Outer Space Treaty clearly does not make these items illegal.
Can I adapt something to it, actually? Regarding that, I think that it's also, maybe important to notice that with, the environmental effect we have there, and, as PJ already described, we also are struggling with weapons review under Article 36 regarding that. Because when we will compare, cyber assets and kinetic ones, the kinetics ones will definitely go in the direction that they wouldn't be able to, pass the tests under the Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1. And on the other hand, the cyber weapons could go in that direction and pass this text, which is I think kind of interesting in this specific area.
So really good point. Do you want to say a few words on reviews of new technologies of warfare quickly for those who just on Article 30?
Okay. Yeah, about Article 36, any new weapons which is under development, from the perspective of IHL needs to go through a specific set of rules when we are considering if it could be seen legal or not. So, and one of the aspects which is necessary to address there is the impact of the weapon. And as PJ already said, the environmental impact, which is huge in the connection of kinetic and the satellite weapons, could cause the fact that the specific weapon, anti-satellite weapon, wouldn't go through this specific test, which should mean at the end of the day that weapon like that couldn't be legally used under the norms of IHL. Nevertheless, regarding the Article 36, as long as I know, it's really good looking on a paper, but the reality is sometimes somewhere on different place.
Interesting addition at the end, but I think I've certainly asked a lot of questions. I'd be really happy now to turn to the audience. I'm sure I see actually a lot of...
add one last
thing sure.
on this, actually, because it also relates to what we intend then with means and methods of warfare. And then in the context, for instance, of the ASAT counter-space capabilities, of course, it's very clear. But then it will also pose the question, okay, when then we repurpose, actually, for instance, maneuverable satellites to perform kinetic counter-space operations. So that is also something to also extend to those kind of operations as methods of warfare. So this is also a consideration that in the implementation we should consider.
Okay, thanks, Julia. So yeah, now I'd like to turn to the audience and see if there are any questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Svetlina van Benthem from the University of Oxford. Thank you for the excellent presentations and moderation. My questions are provoked by Anna's presentation, but I would imagine they have applicability across all three. I was wondering, first of all, on this question of attribution for the conduct of private parties, if we leave that to the side and we think about attribution in cases where it's a little bit easier, where it would be the attributable failures of state organs to take proactive measures to protect in relation to whether it's undersea cables or it's satellites, do you see any scope for such due diligence obligations that can actually assist in these areas? And if so, do you think that there would be a heightened standard of due diligence because of the importance of these activities? And my second question relates to this idea of modernizing space instruments and updating UNCLOS. This might be quite unwise, especially in the current geopolitical environment. We might end up with something which is much worse than what is currently in these instruments. So in that light, I was wondering, do you think that what are the glaring gaps that can't be filled through the reinterpretation of what we already have? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Regarding the first question and due diligence aspect there, I really think that, especially in the way that we need, I will put it in a different way. Satellites could be seen like a high-risk asset. And from this point of view, like the due diligence and also like the oversee of the states of this infrastructure is definitely on place, and states should be really cautious like what is happening on the orbit. On the other hand, like sometimes what we see from the registration of satellites in general, it's just about the registration and not like the other steps which are like monitoring the situation. So yeah, I'm convinced that like due diligence is definitely a really important topic there. On the other hand, not really sure if it is already on the table in that way as you posted. And regarding the second question and UNCLOS and like the gaps that should be filled, I think that what should be filled definitely on that way is like the complexity of the system, because when we will get like on the high seas, like the subsea cables are like starting to be like connecting with nothing because they are not flagged. So from that point of view, it could be really difficult to get to the way, okay, we have a problem here, like cybersecurity or whatever it'll be, but who should it be like tied to? So I think that definitely like the gap, which is like connected with like the lack of regulation on the high sea and like the complexity of the system and like the multiple owners of the cables, this will be something we should need to address.
Perhaps. Yes, I also want to add something. Go ahead, PJ.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to chime in on the second part, and I'm going to stand in opposition to you. The modernization of the Outer Space Treaty. You hear this all the time. The Outer Space Treaty is old. Space is new now. The Outer Space Treaty is old. We got to rewrite it. The Outer Space Treaty is very, very general. It's not a prescriptive treaty. It does not keep you from doing a lot of things, right? There are two clauses that are like, thou shalt not do this. One says you can't claim territory in space, and the other one, a very important one, says that you shouldn't station nuclear weapons in space. Extraordinarily important provision, right? Because if there's a nuke in space, the attack time is down to like 10 minutes, and that's really bad if you're the target of that. So there was a guy that used to work for the State Department in the United States, and he wrote a really interesting paper, and he points out that there is this body of space law literature that's, hey, we got to go and rewrite the treaties. And he's like, that's not what we do in most areas, right? We don't write a treaty and then write another treaty and then write another treaty and then write another treaty. What we do is actually supplement the treaty with other mechanisms, with national laws, with policy documents, with UN General Assembly resolutions, with all of this stuff that creates this sort of matrix, this governance area of what is acceptable behavior in those terms. And so I think that, usually when you hear this notion of we've got to rewrite the treaty, it's often, and not in your case, you actually were on the responsibility bit, it's usually about Article 2, because people want to go and own an asteroid. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't actually keep people from doing that. But there's this notion that law somehow is a stumbling block. I don't think the Outer Space Treaty is a stumbling block to anything. I think that it's a facilitator, but states have to believe in it, right? The moment that somebody violates Article 4, we don't have that treaty anyway. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, really.
Perhaps just to add instead to the first question, and is also which actually relates also to the obligation of constant supervision of the state. Here in space law, we had a huge debate on how we should interpret this obligation. Is it an obligation of means or is it an obligation of result? And while the former would be, like the latter interpretation would be the most advisable, in the end, through state practice to this date, we see that it's mostly an obligation of means that the state basically exhausts by putting in place an authorization process through the licensing process. So also in that sense, the scope and the extent of such actually even continuous obligation of supervision in state practices has actually been quite restricted and narrow. So that is maybe something also to add. And another element instead that I would like to add to PJ, which I also agree on the fact that indeed we should maybe, because the Outer Space Treaty is a framework treaty, but of course then is how do we operationalize it that matters. I think in this sense, which actually is really underexplored by the doctrine, is how we could use the operational exercises, defense exercises, to operationalize these provisions. For instance, how could we identify specific assets as critical and of which the incapacitation, even temporary, would constitute an existential threat to national security. So there are also ways to, let's say, operationalize the treaties through, for instance, exercises. We saw this also on the increasing, actually, also discussion within exercises or a commitment at the end of an exercise, as it happened actually last May, on responsible behavior in space, which was just put at the end of an exercise. So also this, let's say, enhanced link between two actually dimensions provides to some extent some normative also value or interpretation to the provisions of the treaty. So that is also something very interesting in the practice, actually.
Thanks, Julia. I'm conscious of time and that it's running out, so I want to maybe take two questions and then we'll have our panelists answer. Maybe if there's time after, we can take another one, but are there other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Iko Takahashi. That's a Japanese lawyer and in a private practice. And in the cyber security area, there's the criminal hacker, just a private status is playing the great role. But is there any possibilities that such kind of a private person, for example, the amateur radio manias can steal the communication and uses a satellite as a weapon? Is there any possibilities? And if there is a possibilities, is there any legal issues in that case? Is my question.
Okay, very interesting question. I think that might be for PJ, but I'll take one more question if there is one. Okay, we'll let you think about it. I don't know, PJ, if you want to get started.
So actually, the first sort of notion of a satellite hack was a private individual. In the 80s, somebody was really mad at HBO for upping their subscription fee, and so an insider hijacked the signal and distributed their own signal to the HBO station. So that's our first sort of cyber attack. And there are a handful of others of these. They're usually sort of hijacking signals. So, in Brazil, for people to communicate up and down the Amazon, they'll hijack a transponder and use a satellite transponder to send their message along. The legal bit of this, I think, goes back to this notion of what we see in Article 6, right? This idea that states have international responsibility for the national activities of their non-governmental actors. And space lawyers can talk to their blue in the face about this because we're not really sure what it means. There is one interpretation that says the state's on the hook for the private actor that did this from their state. But then you get caught up in this notion, well, what is a national activity? Is that a national activity? And that opens up this whole other Pandora's box. Is a national activity something that the state says should happen, or is it something that happens from that state? And so I would say, yes, lots of legal issues. I don't know what the answers to them are, though.
Anna or Julia, do you want to come in as well?
No, I actually agree with PJ, and I think that also states don't know the answer yet. So actually that is indeed an issue.
Great. Well, now that Pandora's box is open, is there someone with another question? No? Okay, so then I'll ask a question, and then we can close after that because we have about 4 or 5 minutes left. So the question will be for all of you. I want to just ask each of you if there's one takeaway that you took from one of your co-panelists, or even both, if you want to, or if there's one sort of comment or question that you want to make to one of your co-panelists. So we can maybe start with you, Julia.
Okay. No, actually, I think we addressed the issue from all perspectives. I really found Anna's actually presentation very interesting. Perhaps one key takeaway that I took from actually this presentation is that the complexity of space security operates on multiple layers. This was demonstrated by Anna, this was demonstrated by PJ, and also to some extent in my presentation. So whenever actually we analyze the space security from a legal point of view, we actually have to address all the layers of this complexity, which is not a mere legal answer, yes or no, blue and white, black or white. So that for sure is one element. And to do that, I think one of the main points which I repeated very many times during this panel is that we have to start to operationalize concepts. So, because for what actually is quite striking in the space security community is how on the layer and on the level of diplomatic, political or legal initiatives, there is one narrative, but then at the operational level, states deploy and pursue a very different stance and a very different approach. So a bit this let's say ambiguity also between what I say and what I actually do in my practice, in my actions, in my programs at the level of investment by creating an enhanced actually integration of commercial actors in my counter space development. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what are my key takeaways are the fact that space is not definitely in a legal vacuum, and it's never necessary to focus it on the way that if we want to deal with something which is connected to space, we need to see it in the broader complex. I think that Julia explained it well, as PJ also mentioned it various times, and that. Even though, maybe, this is the thing we not that much agree with PJ about, the space law regulation is maybe sufficient. On the other hand, the next step we need to do is to find the provisions which could help us in the area which are not sufficiently developed, at least for now. So that's it.
And I'm going to kind of echo this. It's this notion of multi-layeredness and integration, so that legal, political, and operational layers that all go together, but also these technologies that are all now sort of compressed together and converged. And I think that is the critical part, right? These are really difficult questions. And maybe I'll end with a quick story, right? So I used to teach a space security law class at the University of Mississippi, and I would spend all this time teaching my students about IHL and how states can't do this, and they can't do that, and they can't do this, and teach them all these scenarios. And then I would bring in a strategist from the Air War College, and he would come in and he'd give them a scenario, and they'd all, like good little law students, be like, "Oh no, that's illegal." And he would say, "Look, when the military is having these conversations, you're just one of the people in the room. the lawyer isn't the one that gets to say, absolutely not, you can't do this. The lawyer gives an opinion, and there is a whole group of people that makes this decision. And that kind of goes to your point there. It's that what we actually do isn't always necessarily what the letter of the law says. But then we have to be able to integrate that within the law. And the lawyer's job is often to leave that room and make a legal argument that supports the action that's been taken, which can be a very uncomfortable place to be. Hey.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm glad that we end on the note that the ICRC has a lot of work left to do, so we still have a long future ahead of us, so that's great. Well, thank you so much. We've run out of time, but we still, of course, have time to please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, because that was really excellent. Thank you so much.